Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those of you joining us on the West Coast. My name is Basil Sadiq, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Volunteer Match. Today, I want to welcome you to a fascinating Nonprofit Insights webinar, where we'll take a deep dive into some data that helps answer the question, do politics influence volunteer behavior? I'm joined this morning by the founder of Spinktank and volunteer engagement thought leader, Erin Spink. Hi, Erin, how's it going?
Great, thanks. Happy to be here.
Likewise. We are also joined by Volunteer Match's marketing manager and my marketing counterpart, Alicia Gabe. Alicia will be helping us today with some of the behind the scenes, like answering your questions and live tweeting. Good morning, Alicia.
Good morning.
All right, we've got some really compelling data to cover today, but before we get started, I did just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. First off, all of you are on an automatic mute, and that just means you don't need to worry about any background noise on your part. But just because we can't hear your voice doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. You should see a GoToWebinar toolbar in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you open that up, you'll see the word questions with either a plus sign or an arrow sign next to it. That's going to be your questions tool. Feel free to type in your questions as we go through today's webinar, and we'll take a break to start answering them about halfway in and then again towards the end. We'll also be live tweeting today, as I mentioned about a minute ago. So if you are on Twitter and would like to ask a question there or join in the conversation, you can do so by using the hashtag VMLearn, like Volunteer Match Learn. Last but not least, we are recording today's webinar, so no need to jot down notes. You can pay full attention to the content that we're going to present, and we'll send you a link to the recording along with the copy of the study's executive summary in just a few hours. Okay, I'm going to take just a quick moment to talk about Volunteer Match. For those of you who are not familiar with our service, you can see our mission statement. Actually, Erin, could you go ahead and,
there we go.
Perfect. There's our mission statement. It's up there at the top. Volunteer Match strengthens communities by making it easier for good people and good causes to connect. We actually recently celebrated our 20th birthday in April, so we are officially more than 2 decades old. During that time, we've helped more than 120,000 nonprofits connect with the volunteers they need to make their vision a reality. Today, we're host to nearly 100,000 volunteer opportunities on Volunteer Match and have facilitated close to 14 million nonprofit volunteer connections since our start. We should actually hit that 14 million number in the next couple of days, so I hope all of you will join us in celebrating that milestone. Volunteer Match is the top-ranked website for online volunteer recruitment. So volunteers who search for ways to give back through Google will typically find our volunteer opportunities listed at the top of their search results. That means if you have any opportunities that need to be filled, get those posted on Volunteer Match and we'll take care of the visibility. I want to also give a huge shout out to the Volunteer Match Learning Center. It's home to more than 20 webinars that provide insight into the world of volunteer engagement, management, and recruitment. It's definitely a great place to go, whether you're new to the field or if you're looking to advance your skill and practice. All right, next up, Erin is going to take a quick moment to tell us about her organization, Think Tank. Take it away, Erin.
Thanks, Basil. So when you have a last name like Spink, you got to own it and work with it. So Spinktank is my private consulting firm. What we do is a lot of engagement, consulting and training for peers in the profession, other leaders of volunteers. But also, I like to focus a lot on research. So today is a great example of one of the pieces of research that I do. And my goal with Spinktank is really to help advance the profession. So we're asking tough questions, we're getting some new and innovative answers, and advancing the profession in general. So I hope you check out the website. We'll mention it again at the end, but if you are interested in receiving the full research report, so you'll of course get the executive summary, but if you want the full research report, all you have to do is sign up for the updates on spinktank.ca, and you'll be sure to get those. So back to you.
Thanks, Erin. Maybe to get us started, let's just quickly go over the agenda for today, and then will you kind of tell us what prompted you to conduct this study? What were you really looking for? What goals or objectives were you trying to solve?
Those are really great questions, and we're definitely going to cover all of those. I'm going to talk to you in a second about a little bit how this came to be, because I think it is a really fascinating example of why we need to do more research in the profession. I'm also going to share with you a little bit about the time frames when this research took place and the time frame that it was actually trying to measure. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the methodology that was used, and then we're going to get into the meat. Or the soy-based protein portion, which is the key findings. And then I think it's really important that we talk about how do we apply this to our work. As leaders of volunteers, it's great to have this information, but then what do we do with it? And do we need to make changes? Do we need to do things differently? And then finally, what's next? So before I begin, I do want to say a really big thank you to Volunteer Match and to Basil, particularly because without him and without Volunteer Match, this research would not have taken place, nor been as successful in terms of getting a strong sample size and a great profile. So I want to give a really big shout out to the team at Volunteer Match. They've been amazing partners. I do want to flag that, we have limited time today, so I'm going to be doing my best to provide a brief but solid overview of the findings. And as I said, the full research report will go into a lot more information in terms of the nitty-gritty of things. So why research, politics and volunteerism? If we think about it, generally, when we look at the levels of civic engagement, they've been declining. And typically, there are main pillars of activity within civic engagement. These are things like voter turnout, which we know has been starkly declining in many cases. We also know, if we're on top of our research, that generally levels of volunteerism are declining. And what you may not know is that volunteerism is actually one of the core pillars of civic engagement. Some of the other areas that people are civically engaged are things like participating in service clubs. Even reading the newspaper is also a form of civic engagement. And so all of these things are things that are undergoing really significant shifts and generally are on the decline. And so it was, a really big change that when the U.S. presidential election was happening in 2016, 2017, that we saw some really big shifts in those standard declining areas of behavior. And certainly here in Canada, we were very keenly interested observers of that. And as you see on the screen, for Volunteer Match Inauguration Day, saw some of the highest traffic ever for the website. And so we knew something was going on. In other spheres, we were seeing other shifts in pro-social behavior, like fundraising, like politically motivated activities, like marches. There was a real rallying. There was a real energy societally. And so for my part, I was wondering if these shifts were also translating into volunteer behavior changes. So I was attending different webinars and reading different pieces about, these massive influxes of donations and how, the AFP and other fundraising professionals were tracking what was going on. Political scientists were looking at this because, of course, this is a very big shift in what they were seeing. And I asked around to peers in the profession, is anybody tracking this? Is anybody quantifying what's going on? And the answer was no. And so I voluntold myself to that, we need to step up. This isn't normally the area of research that I would focus in on, but I really felt that it was a real kind of shifting in how people were engaging. And I felt that it was really important to try to quantify this and track it. And I really wanted to make sure that as volunteer engagement professionals, we were plugged into what was occurring. So I wanted to collect data from two different groups. One was individuals, the other was nonprofits and charities, because they're on the receiving end of these changes. And what this did was it provided not only a checks and balance for what each group was reporting and making sure that they were actually saying the same thing, but it also allowed me to see where, if any, there were pockets of particular change taking place. So, for example, were there big level jumps in participation from certain demographic groups? So was it youth that were mobilizing far more than they normally do? Or was it around specific causes? So if we think about organizations like Planned Parenthood, they were very politically visible and targeted in terms of profile and media within the presidential race. So was it just organizations like those that were seeing any of these shifts? And I also wanted to get a sense of, was this just a whole level set change? Were we seeing changes across the board, or were we seeing shifts where perhaps everybody was seeing increases or decreases, right? You could also argue that perhaps people were saying, well, I'm donating instead of volunteering, right? And because I'm politically moved and we're seeing these giant surges in donations, that perhaps people were choosing to donate instead of donate money instead of donating their time. So I really wanted to hear from both sides and figure out where the truth is, because it was somewhere in the middle. So the time frames that I want you to keep in mind, one is the survey time frame. So we were, we were conducting this research between June to approximately September last year. But what we asked respondents to do was to reflect on their feelings and their behavior and activity between January to April 2017. And that was obviously right after Inauguration Day and the 3 months afterwards. And the questions needed to capture a time recent enough to still be fresh in people's minds, but also allow for busy nonprofits to compile, monthly metrics and stats and things like that. And I do want to reinforce that this is a snapshot in time. It's the type of research that covers one specific moment. It doesn't cover changes that have taken place since this period. What my hope is that there's national level research that's done in both the US and in Canada, and that if there are, for example, continued or ongoing increases or changes, that those will be captured and reflected in that type of research, which is really more of that longitudinal aspect. So the survey was conducted using SurveyMonkey, a simple tool, and the survey allowed both individuals as well as organizations to complete a series of questions. And of course, this was after a lot of feedback and testing, a lot of input. We did promotion, very much led by Volunteer Match across North America, but really we were primarily focusing on American respondents. But and we'll go into this in a second, we did have respondents from around the world. Some basic analysis was done to isolate certain groups of respondents and compare and contrast their responses to the overall group. So here's a little bit of a heat map, just to kind of show overall for individuals, we had 92% from the US, which is of course what we wanted, because we really wanted to hear from Americans about what was going on in America, but we did have a 4% from Canada and another 4% from elsewhere. And then in terms of the number of organizations, we had 220, and a little over half of them were from the US, and then the other bulk actually was from Canada. Just a little bit about the organization. We had a range of entirely volunteer-driven organizations to those with multi-million-dollar budgets with hundreds of staff. So we really had a very interesting range and representation from all the different permutations and sizes and scopes that nonprofits and charities take across North America. 20% had a $1 to $5 million budget, and then 17% had $100,000 to a $500,000 budget. So we had the big boys, and we had much smaller. 13% of the organizations had over 500 employees, and 13% had 1 to 5. So we feel very confident that we really saw representation from a wide range enough of organizations that if there were specific targets in terms of, only organizations of this size benefited, that would have come out. In terms of the particular focus of the organization, about 24% were health, 22% were social services, 8% were philanthropic and volunteerism promotion, something like a volunteer match, and then the rest were a mix. In terms of the focus, 50% worked at the local level, and 23% at more of a regional level. The reason that these numbers are different from what's on the screen is because it's proportional. So that's why that's just a little bit different. So overall, the findings for the organization is that there were small to moderate increases in the number of volunteer applications. And this was across ages, across genders. We weren't seeing, women coming out in droves, despite the fact that we had the Women's March. We didn't see, only youth stepping up and increasing the number of, or their frequency of volunteering. So it was really actually quite general in terms of the increase. We also saw organizations reported a slight increase in the number of short-term and episodic volunteer applications. So as opposed to people wanting to take part in long-term opportunities, it really was more focused on shorter-term episodic involvement. 21% of the organizations said that applicants were directly referencing politics as a motivation to volunteer. So that's pretty significant, 1 in 5. I can't think of a time, having been in this profession for over 20 years, that I've actually ever had anybody reference politics as a motivation. So I want you to kind of put that in the back of your head for when we talk about application to our work. And almost half of the organizations said that they noticed changes, and that could have been in their current volunteer base, and it might have been, current volunteers giving more hours, taking on more responsibility, things like that. And so I think that is also really significant, that at least in that 3-month period, 50% of organizations, and as I said, because we had such a great diversity in the sample of organizations, I can tell you that this was across the board. So it wasn't just all health charities that saw this. It wasn't social services charities that saw this. It was really across the board. And I think that's something that's quite striking. In terms of the findings for the individuals, again, just to give you a little bit of an overview, in terms of the sample, it was 75% women, 25% men. Every age group was represented, but the majority were between 55 to 74 years. So it's the sample size did skew a little bit older, but when we look at who typically completes surveys, that's not out of the norm. One of the questions I did ask was on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being the leftist of left and 10 being the rightest of right in terms of conservatism. Where would you say your general political inclinations lie? And people were generally on average about 4 out of 10. So very slightly left leaning, but certainly not, it wasn't a runaway train of Democrats versus Republicans who were in the sample size. So one of the questions that we asked, and this was actually used to filter a number of the further findings that I'm going to go into, was the question, has any, how strongly do the two North American federal or nationwide leaders reflect your values? So it was a simple Likert scale with not at all being on one end and strongly the other. So the question was, how strongly does Prime Minister Trudeau reflect your values? So in the green, we see that 29% of people that responded said that he strongly reflected their values, and 9% said he did not at all reflect their values. For Trump, it was actually a kind of inverse relationship where only 16% of people said that he strongly reflected their values and 63% said not at all. I do want to take a moment just to explain why there's differences and why things aren't adding up to 100, is that there are some questions that were mandatory and others that weren't. And so although we had 1,700 respondents and 1,400 and change of those were individuals, not everybody completes every question. And so that's why you may be noticing why some things don't add up to 100%. But of the 1,258 respondents who answered the question, 36% of them said yes when asked, has any of your volunteer activity been motivated by the current political climate? And so if we compare that to that 36% to the 21% we just saw in terms of organizations having applicants actually self-identify, we know that there's a bit of a gap there. And so, what that means is, in my mind, that that a lot of the time, and we know this for people who have been in the profession for a while, we know that people don't always espouse their true deep-seated motivations for why they're volunteering. And I think that 15% is significant enough that people may very much have had that as a motivation to volunteer, but maybe either didn't feel comfortable sharing it because, of course, politics and religion and a few other topics are the things that we're always taught not to talk about at the dinner table. And so people might not have felt comfortable, self-identifying that, because of the political climate, I am choosing to do this. Or it might just be because, they're current volunteers. And so there wasn't that opportunity really to say, hey, I want to increase my hours because what's going on in the US right now. What I would also say is that there was a really big difference between the people who identified as saying, yes, some of my volunteer activity has been motivated by the political climate based on whether or not they felt that the political leader reflected or didn't their values. And so only 8.5% of the people who felt that President Trump very much reflected their values identified that some of their volunteer activity was politically motivated, whereas 81.5% of people who indicated that President Trump did not at all reflect their values identified that some of their volunteer activity was politically motivated. So I think there's a very stark difference there. So for people who feel, yep, the current political leader reflects my values versus those who feel, no, not at all, that they don't, there was very big differences in how they behaved. So a little bit more about findings from the individuals. And so what I did is I broke it down into 2 or 3 segments. So one is the current volunteers. But in the survey, I also asked, if you've never volunteered, tell me a little bit about that. If you're new to volunteering, if you've started volunteering in the last, year, tell me about that. And if you're a former volunteer. So this is specifically about current volunteers. So respondents who were currently active volunteers who said that their volunteering was politically motivated and agreed that the Trump presidency did not at all reflect their values, said that about 66% of their volunteerism was politically motivated or influenced. So the question was, first, is any of your volunteer activity influenced or motivated by the current political climate? Yes. And if so, then what percent of your motivation? So what they said is 66% of their motivation to change their volunteer behavior was due to the political influence, which I think is that's well over half, of more than 50% of your motivation. And the interesting thing is that when I asked, okay, so what are you doing what changes are you making to your volunteer behavior? There was 3 top changes. The number one change was advocacy. So they were signing petitions, they were calling elected officials, they were promoting the cause. A lot of it's centered on social media engagement with the charities that they were volunteering at. So there was a lot of that, but only slightly less than that was increasing their hours, right? And so when we think about how we have to operate and how dependent our organizations are on having people willing to commit good chunks of time to helping us get things done, having people willing to increase their hours is a really significant change. And then the third top change was actually volunteering at more organizations. And I thought that this was really fascinating because one of my fears was that, especially because during the U.S. presidential campaign, as you know, there were some charities and some causes that were very particularly highlighted and targeted, positive and negative, within the campaign in terms of being referenced. And I'll just use the Planned Parenthood as an example. And one of my questions or fears was, were we going to see food banks lose volunteers to Planned Parenthood because maybe people felt, this charity needs me more than the charity I currently volunteer for. So I'm really excited to say that, in fact, it wasn't that they were volunteering at different places, it's that they were volunteering at more organizations. So they were doing everything they were doing and then doing more. And I think that is something, I think that's something that's really fascinating. I think it's very positive. And the other thing I want to share about current volunteers is that even the 249 respondents who said, I wouldn't say that the Trump presidency, it doesn't at all reflect my values, but my volunteer behavior is not politically motivated at all. Even despite that, they still made positive and significant changes to their volunteer behavior in that same time frame. And what is, I think, really fascinating is that their top 3 changes were the same as the first group. Those who said, yes, this is politically motivated. It's just, they were just ordered slightly differently, but actually, very consistently. So the number one change for people who said, no, President Trump does not at all reflect my values, but no, I'm not changing my behavior because of that. In spite of that, they increased their hours quite significantly. And then they also said they were volunteering at more organizations. And then thirdly, increased advocacy was their top 3. And I think that also makes sense when we think about, if someone says, no, this presidency is not reflective of my values, and yes, I'm going to change my behavior because of that, then it makes sense that advocacy is the number one change that those people would make. But I do find it fascinating that even for those who said, no, not my cup of tea, but I'm not doing anything differently specifically because of that, they still had advocacy as one of their top 3 changes. And I think, it's possible that the consistency between both groups of active volunteers may be due to a number of things. It may be because we don't do a good job of making deliberate asks to volunteers in other forms of support, or it could be because increasing hours, volunteering with more organizations, and doing more advocacy work are all really simple ways for people to do more of what they're already doing. And I don't have the answers to why that is, but I do think that it's fascinating and potentially worthy of further study. So I've got one more slide to go, and then we're going to pause for questions. But I do want to share a little bit of the findings from new and former volunteers, because this is where I think some of the most interesting stuff was found. So about 11% of respondents said that they started volunteering in 2017 for the first time. And what I think is shocking is that more than half of them, or 57%, said that their motivation to volunteer was influenced by the political landscape. And, I drilled down a little bit further, and it's fascinating to me that of those people who said, yep, I started volunteering for the first time, and yes, this was this was in large part because of the political landscape, almost 80% of those same respondents indicated that President Trump's presidency did not at all reflect their values. And when asked to what degree, again, what percentage of your motivation, it was 80% of their motivation to volunteer. Now, if we take that in contrast, only 8 or 11% of the people who said that President Trump very much reflects their values, it's interesting, it was a much smaller portion, right? So again, we're seeing a trend of people who are saying, this is different than what I want to see, and I am much more inclined to change my behavior than for those who say, yep, this is totally in line with what I want to see. Now, what was interesting is that actually their portion, or the percentage of their motivation to volunteer as being driven by the political landscape, was actually the same. It was about 80%, but it's the number of people who are mobilized that is so starkly different between those who feel that the presidency reflects their values versus those who don't. For former volunteers, there was about 280 of them in the sample. This is considered anybody who's volunteered in the past but was not active in the previous year. About 50% of them indicated a strong intention to become active again in the future as a volunteer. Now, of that group, about 74% of them said that the Trump presidency did not at all reflect their values. And when asked what percentage of their motivation to becoming an active volunteer again was due to the political landscape, they said about 65% of their motivation was driven by this. So the other thing, that not only is this actually creating new volunteers, but for people who have kind of been inactive, this actually could be a mitigating circumstance to actually getting them back volunteering again. Now, if we contrast this with 13 former volunteers who said that President Trump did strongly reflect their values, only 34% of their motivation to become an active volunteer again was due to the political landscape. So what we can infer from this generally is that when people feel that they're not supportive of the political leadership, they're more inclined to either start volunteering if they feel that their values are threatened, or people who were previously volunteering to start again, much more than those whose values are being represented. And again, you might say, well, duh, that's pretty obvious, because if we think about even word of mouth recruitment, or if we think about public profile and reputation, when we have a great experience, we tell one person. When we have a bad experience, we tell 20. And so I think it is very much in keeping with human behavior. But what I am excited about is the fact that we can actually now quantify this for the first time as it relates to volunteer behavior. So I'm going to pause here and ask Basil and Alicia if there's any questions.
Wow, that's lots of great data and insight to digest. Thank you, Erin. So yeah, we've actually got some really good questions, and I think that just means that our listeners are pretty engaged to today's topic. So why don't we take a quick moment to answer one question now, and if we have some time toward the end, we'll answer a few more questions then. If you have a question around today's topic, please let us know in the next 20 minutes or so, and we'll be sure to include those questions later on. All right, so Erin, one of our listeners asks, do you have any advice on engaging and recruiting volunteers who are motivated by the current political climate, but without taking an explicitly political stance and or possibly isolating other volunteers?
Oh, yeah. So how do we take advantage without taking advantage, right? Really good question. And it's something that, actually, on the next slide, when we start talking about applying this to our work, I think that that's actually something that as leaders of volunteers, we need to take into consideration. One thing that I thought about was really honing in on the fact that volunteerism is one of the most concrete ways that we build the communities that we live in. And, it's not that this language is new in any way, but everyday volunteers build the kind of community and world that they want to see. And so I think when we talk about it very much in a very positive way, in a very general way, what we're doing is we're standing up for our values, right? We're saying that these values are important to me. And that's not to say that other people's values aren't valid, or don't have value. But I think that would be one way that I would position to say, this is a time when maybe, this charity is very much in need. If you believe that this is important to have in your community, whether it's a food bank, whether it's an animal shelter, whether it's a hospital, then we need you to step up. And now is the time. I think that can be a very compelling message. So that would be, just off the top of my head, one thing that I would recommend in terms of utilizing it. It could also be that you want to think about how do we actually start maybe exploring this in our either our intake and screening steps, or even in the roles that we develop. Maybe you actually want to advertise for a political monitor volunteer, right? Somebody who's tapped into this stuff, somebody who's already reading the newspapers, keeping on top of what the different parties are saying, what the different candidates have to say. If this is something that really taps into a passion and a motivation of a volunteer, and I would say probably most organizations that we work in don't have the bandwidth to give that time and attention to that type of work, that could be a great fit, right? Where someone feels very very passionate about making sure that this organization stays funded, or that this organization continues to be able to deliver programs and services. And obviously we need to work with the current political leadership, whatever elected officials there are. So that could be actually a really neat way to engage if you do have people who are specifically saying, yes, I don't like what's happening, or I want to see more of what's happening. Well, here's some ways that you could help us. So that would be just off the top of my head some ways that we could also further embed it in our work.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erin.
Great, thank you. All right, so what a perfect segue to the slide of applying this to our work. And I hope that the last finding that I shared with you caught your attention, which is that it's overwhelmingly the people who feel strongly against something or someone who have expressed this by starting to volunteer. The reason being that we know that volunteering rates are declining, and of even more concern is that there are fewer and fewer of those super volunteers. In Canada, the stat is generally that I think 23% of volunteers do 76% of the hours. It's a Canadian stat, but I think it's very transferable to the US. I think in the UK, it's like 8% give over 50%. So I think it's a truism, right? It's the 80-20 rule, that 20% of people give 80% of the hours or the contributions. And I think that this is really critical for two reasons. One is that most of our organizations are absolutely predicated and based on having a real core group of volunteers who are either in our offices, every week, or, consistently volunteering, taking on huge projects for us. We are really dependent on volunteer leadership in this sector. And if volunteers went on strike for a day, our worlds would literally come to a standstill. They utterly would come to a standstill. And so if we see that fewer and fewer of these kind of super volunteers that we are so dependent on are that's just not how people are volunteering, we need to figure out what we can do to turn that around, or how we are going to respond as organizations. But the second piece is that, to my knowledge, we've never been able to pinpoint the specific circumstances that create a new volunteer. There's been investigations into what motivates someone to volunteer, but not a specific environmental cause. And I think we're entering a really different landscape today with, we've got major time poverty and busyness, but also broadly those decreasing civic engagement activities across the board. And so as leaders of volunteers, we need to be aware of and understand how to support as much as we can the creation of new volunteers, as well as understand their motivations so we can work with them to find a fit. The other direct application I see is the opportunity to position volunteer engagement as a core form of civic engagement within our organizations, and how connected all civic engagement activities are. We know from US research that people who volunteer are 10 times more likely to donate. We also know from research that people who volunteer at a certain level, which I believe is about 60 hours on average a year, they are the people who are not only more likely to donate, 10 times more likely to donate, but they also donate significantly more per gift. And so it's that truism of the few give the most. But we need to really make sure that people understand that volunteer engagement is a critical foundational form of civic engagement for organizations that needs to be invested in. These things are all connected. These behaviors are all connected. And so by investing in and cultivating volunteerism, we may also see other supportive activities of our organizations, like public advocacy, like donations, like social media engagement, all the things that we are all trying to do and see more of, and engage our communities with. The one thing I do want to be very clear about is that this is not a value judgment about those who are supportive or not of any political leader. We all have our opinions, but this is not, in my mind, anything particular about anything other than this point in time. This is an examination of how our more polarized political climate is or isn't impacting people's volunteer behaviors. Clearly, we see that overall it is changing people's behaviors, but not universally. It seems focused on those people who are not supportive of the current political leadership. Now, taken in the most positive light, this could be the start of a broader revitalization of civic engagement and a diminishing of the political apathy that North America has been suffering from for the past few decades. And these, of course, would be generally positive things for all of the US and Canada and all of its citizens, regardless of your political stripes. So I think that a core piece of advocacy that we can do in our work is to say, hey, volunteerism isn't just this nice little thing. This is a direct lifeline to tapping into the passions and motivations and values of the communities that we are not only supporting, but also representing and trying to engage. And I think that if we're able to do a good job of aligning volunteer engagement as a core form of civic engagement, that gives a lot of weight and importance to our work. We know it's important. We know that this is heavy duty stuff. We know that this is a, I like to joke that volunteerism is a gateway drug to organizations. We know that it's a great in with people, that it's an easy ask to make in terms of, we'd love to have you engaged with us, but it's not just a simple come out and volunteer for a couple hours. Come out and volunteer for a couple hours. You're going to learn more about us as an organization. You're going to see us directly in action. You're going to see the great work that we do. You're going to meet the people, often that we're trying to touch. And so it's just the first way that we can, really begin a relationship with people. And so I think we need to do a better job as leaders of volunteers to actually connect what we do to the bigger and the weightier stuff. So you might be asking, what's next? As Basil has said, the executive summary will be sent to you after the webinar. For those wanting to get the complete research report, you can sign up on spinktank.ca to receive updates, and I'll make sure that you get that. In terms of the survey itself, what I'm hoping to do is a relaunch of the survey after the next American election, after November 2020, to compare the data. And I think, regardless of the outcome, we'll at least have a benchmark to compare the results to, and to get a sense of whether this was just a perfect storm of factors that led people to rise up in new ways for some, or do more for others, or whether this is a new landscape that's permanently changed the way and the why of people volunteering. So I'm really excited to to just find out. And like I said, I don't think any of these things are, or many of these things are earth-shattering. They're probably affirming what you see in your daily work. But I think the fact that we now have some of this data quantified is really important, because we can now refer back to it. So hopefully there's a few more questions, and I'll be happy to answer as many of them as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually got quite a few more questions in, which is great. We have about 14 minutes, so I think we'll have time to answer all of them. But to just get us started, I just wanted to share one comment that one of our listeners made. Julia says that, I don't think the research shows that if you agree with the political agenda, then you're less likely to volunteer. I think it shows that this president has generated an increase in volunteering because of his stance on a multitude of social and social justice issues. Julia, I think that's an excellent point. Over the last couple of years, really the last year and a half, I think we've personally noticed and seen the trends, but really this is the first time that we've been able to quantify volunteer sentiments. And I think being able to do this research again in 2020 will just help give us sort of like a benchmark to assess our current data and see how sentiments progress over time. Erin, is there anything that you might want to add to that?
No, I think, Julia, that's a really valid perspective on the data. And of course, one of the challenges of research analysis is that it's all your interpretation of what it means. But I think that that's a very valid way of looking at it. And I think, as Basil said, time will tell. Was this a blip? Was this a broader societal change? So I'm really excited to find out. And I welcome any comments like that, because certainly a lot of this is my own interpretation, and I'm not the smartest person in this room. So would love to hear other people's thoughts too.
Awesome, thanks, Erin. This next question comes from Shan, and Shan says, volunteer centers with diverse member organizations supporting various causes often advocate for the importance of volunteerism and advocate for taking action and being civically engaged. However, some political entities aim to reduce civic engagement and benefit from an inert population that feels hopeless to make meaningful change. So, is the promotion of volunteerism an innately politically partisan cause? It's a great question.
Ooh, that's a thinker. I mean, every volunteer promoting organization that I'm familiar with, including Volunteer Match and the volunteer centers in Canada, are typically apolitical. So while I think politics and the political machine benefits, because of course, if we think about the political process, it is incredibly dependent on volunteers. It's those people that are canvassing, it's those people that are knocking on doors, that are putting the political campaign together. And we sometimes forget that actually political campaigns and politics are one of the biggest consumers of volunteers and engagers of volunteers. And I've never met anybody in politics who actually has a certificate in volunteer management or anything like that. So I definitely think that it's one of those water level things, right? When the watermark goes up, we all benefit. So I think that there's never a downside to seeing a more civically engaged or high volunteerism rate in the population. That I think that's one of the challenges, is when one person benefits, we typically all benefit. But I think that there are some inherent checks and balances in our society. You know, there's lots of nonprofits that are for something and nonprofits in the same sphere that are against it, right? And so we do inherently have all of those political views across the spectrum represented in nonprofits, because nonprofits, you know, absolutely have political views, maybe not by, you know, in a partisan way in terms of a political party, but I would say generally in a values-based. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I would say yes, absolutely. You know, politicians will benefit, and that could be used for ill. But I think it's never a bad thing to have a more civically engaged population.
Great, thanks, Erin. Another listener, also named Erin, just asked, do you think this research can be replicated at a smaller, maybe more local scale, where significant political change has already taken place? And the example that she references is the provincial government in Ontario. Can you help answer that?
Yeah, so I actually think I know that, Erin. We like to joke in Canada that we're so small we all know each other, but I think I actually do, in fact, know this, Erin. I actually really considered whether or not I would replicate it in Ontario, because we did absolutely have a very similar situation where we had a very politically divisive and values divisive leader recently elected after a very long-term government was in place. And absolutely, I think that it works best at a macro level, but I don't think that at a micro, even a municipal or a regional or local level, that this would not still elicit some really interesting results. I think, you know, the political systems are a little bit different in Canada and the US. But I think there's some really big truisms that have been uncovered in this research about how people engage with politics and with government, regardless of whether you're in the US or Canada. So absolutely, I hope that it's applicable. And you know, if anybody you know, is interested and has a situation that they would like to partner with me, I'm happy to share this this template, and we can do more of this. We can replicate this, because that's where I would say we really start seeing where the changes occur. I think one thing that does support this being done at a more macro, larger level is because that's where you start seeing, I think, the broader shifts in activity, right? So everyone cares about who the president is, or who in Ontario the premier is, because we're all impacted, right? And it can have, to varying degrees, really significant impacts depending on how the government is structured, right? And how much power that person has. So I would say that you might not see as much of that happening on like a local council or something like that. But that's just my assumption. So yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to me to conduct this research in their local area, I'd be thrilled, because I think the more we can do this, the more we're actually going to be able to say what is consistent across the board and where are there differences and when.
Awesome, thanks. I am loving how engaged all of our listeners are in this conversation. For every question that we answer, it seems like we get 2 more, and that's wonderful. Before we dive into the next question, our listener Julia added that she hasn't found volunteering, volunteers, or dedication declining, just the opposite in this climate. Regardless of the season, though, she believes the reason is the way she invests in her volunteers as humans by either caring for them while they're part of her program, following up occasionally or regularly, and developing friendships when she can. She also adds that Volunteer Match often reminds her to thank volunteers through volunteer recognition events. Important, absolutely, but more important is making the volunteer feel valued in the moment. That's really great advice. Last thing that she adds is, we know volunteering is a way for people to get to know the agency and the people that they serve. But she also talks about what the value is to the volunteer, feeling good about themselves, loyalty to the organization or to the corporation if it's a corporate event, or team building. So really trying to figure out that win-win. So glad you shared that perspective, Julia. I think a lot of our listeners will also see some value in that as well. And it looks like we have time for maybe one more question. One of our listeners, Anastasia, asks, would Spinktank consider doing the same survey after midterm elections? So upcoming congressional elections.
Oh, well, Spinktank would consider anything. You know, I would love to work with some people, because of course, you know, I have a full-time job, and Spinktank is not my full-time endeavor, but if somebody's interested and would like to help me make it happen, I would be happy to, because you know, this research really is a snapshot, right? And I know, at least in Canada, the national research that we do on volunteer trends only happens every 4 years. So there's a lot that can happen in 4 years. So I would be very interested. And if anybody's interested in joining me, I'd love to form a group of people who we could make this happen. That'd be great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us today. Erin, when you have a sec, can you navigate to that final slide, please?
Yes. There we go.
Thank you. All right. So just as a reminder, this webinar was recorded. We will send you a link to the recording along with a copy of the study's executive summary in just a few hours. We have some great resources on our blog, Engaging Volunteers, which both Alicia and I help manage. And then to stay in the know about our future webinars or any of our upcoming webinars, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. When we announce a webinar, we'll usually do it through there. So that's a great way to keep in touch. If you want to ask a question about today's topic, or if your question did not get answered, please reach out to me. My contact information is up there on the screen. Whether it's a question for me, for Erin, or for Alicia, I'll make sure it gets to the right person. Last but definitely not least, special thank you to Erin for all of your hard work on the study and all of your contributions to the field of volunteer engagement. I hope all of our listeners enjoyed today's topic. If you have some time, please stick around for a super brief survey. And that's it. We're all done. Thanks again, everyone, for attending today. We hope to see you on a future Volunteer Match webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.